Hello and welcome to There's No Business Like, a podcast where friends and industry colleagues explore topics and interview leaders in our industry of professional theatrical touring. Hello, hello, hello. I'm Danielle Van Hook from the Alden in McLean, Virginia, and I am here today with my friends, Katie.
Hi, everyone. Katie Miller with Michigan Maven Creative Associates in Midland, Michigan.
Kevin
Maynard coming at you from Tallahassee with opening nights at Florida State University.
And Josh
Benson hanging out in Marion, Illinois at the Marion Cultural and Civic Center.
Hey, well, it's great to see you guys here today. Today's episode is an interview that I did with Michelle Herzog, and she started her career in grant making. So today, I just wanted to kick this off by talking a little bit about what it's like to be on the other side of the grant process. How have you all sort of participated in grant making other than being somebody receiving a grant?
Well, Danielle, I have sat on a couple of grant panels reading those grants, but also at Quad City Arts, we wrote grants so that we could grant out smaller amounts to local smaller organizations. So we did that from the beginning, putting out the guidelines, getting the grants in, doing the final reports, all of those things, which is very rewarding, but it is a lot of work to make sure that all of those things are being followed.
I've sat on a few grant panels with the Illinois Arts Council, and that's the primary admin aspect that I've been a part of.
Yeah, I have a long history with grant making. I actually started in youth philanthropy when I was in high school. So if you don't know, Michigan is the seat of youth philanthropy in the United States. My youth advisory council in Muskegon was the first one established in the state of Michigan. And I had the pleasure of serving on that youth advisory council when I was in high school and as president for 2 years. So I learned about the grant making process very early on when I was a teenager. And that has been a big part of my life ever since. And then I served on, I think, 7 grant panels over the course of 7 years for the Michigan Arts and Culture Council, reviewing project grants, operational grants, rising leader grants. And it was always a lot of work, but a ton of fun. And I learned so much about other organizations in the state and took tons of inspiration from what other people were doing. So I always found it to be a really valuable process to be a part of.
Your tidbits about Michigan are probably in my top 20 favorite things about you.
Yeah, Michigan's
I can give you a whole lecture about youth philanthropy in the state of Michigan.
I think we heard it.
I was also the statewide youth philanthropy intern for the Council of Michigan Foundations when I was in college. So I ran the state conference for teenagers involved in youth philanthropy between my freshman and sophomore years of college.
Wow, that's not surprising. So I've also been on, grant panels here locally in Fairfax, as well as, larger regional ones, and then, federal NEA type things. But I've also worked in a couple of different organizations as somebody who creates grant or program opportunities that kind of people apply for, and have worked through sort of that software development and that data sort of storage, as well as help for panelists to, be able to take a lot of information and kind of pare it down. So whenever you guys have been on panels, how do you go about reading through the guidelines and tackling that application pile that you have?
Well, when I would review for Michigan Arts and Culture Council, I'd probably have about 30 applications to review in 3 weeks. So I literally would schedule 2 to 3 hours every single night and just start working my way through reading about an hour per grant application to be really thorough. And you're required to make notes and do scoring and all of that. So I think one of the key things is to give yourself enough time to really give each application the attention it deserves. Yeah, it was a lot of work, but it's great at the same time.
One of the conversations that happened during those panel meetings, I look back on now and I'm petrified by it, honestly, because it was critical of if you didn't have enough sustainable income, we couldn't give you a grant because we're not sure that you're going to be around long enough for the grant to be effective. But then if you have too much income, we're not going to give you the grant because you're actually too successful and doing too well. And so you're penalized for working on a trim budget, but you're also penalized for being successful. I was in my late 20s whenever I was on the panel for Illinois Arts Council. And it's now in my career that I look back on that time and just think, what a jacked up model of evaluation that we had.
And I also too think that really highlights how guidelines of grants have changed over the years. And, there's been a lot of incremental changes in the past couple of years, I think post 2020, to really streamline a lot of that. But I remember having similar-ish conversations when I was sort of an intern in a grant making situation where, yeah, it was very similar. And kind of being on the other side of it over a course of time, I feel like you really do kind of start to see how that changes and how that value shift happens.
I mean, I don't know that I have any sort of like, great process. I mean, really, like I just sit down to actually read through all the guidelines. And that's something I sort of force myself to do because, I think that there's plenty of people who sit on these panels who don't, to be quite honest. And so I always like force myself to do it to just make sure that I actually understand that. And then much like Katie, I schedule time, sort of, or just really like goals, being like, look, if I have to have this many done by this point, I need to read X amount a day, or, however that goes. Because my first time sitting on a grant panel, I did not, and I forgot about them. So I got to read 30 grants in about 2 days. And I don't know if you've ever read that many grants and made notes on that many grants for 2 days. It is mind numbing.
I did every time.
I am not surprised. But no, and if I don't make that note, I will always forget, and then we'll get to like a couple days out and go, oh no.
Yeah. And I think, Danielle, it's interesting. It's one of the things that we talked a lot about in the grant panel process with Michigan Arts and Culture Council was sort of the idea of bias on behalf of the reviewers, and taking into account the fact that we were reviewing grants from organizations of literally all sizes and budget types, and with various amount of staffs, with various amount of experience, right? So trying to remove our own bias in terms of like the perfectly formatted proposal, or the grammar is exactly right, or this is exactly the type of supporting attachment we want to see that's perfectly formatted and is aesthetically pleasing, and all of these things that could really sort of bias you towards the bigger organizations that have tons of staff, that have a ton of experience in grant writing. Oh, they're really shiny and pretty, and so we're going to give them the money because it's really well done. But there could be like, oh, tiny little historical council that has 2 volunteers running it, and they are working their butts off to try and get additional funding to bring a program to their community. Just because their application isn't as shiny as others doesn't mean it's not as worthy of funding as some of these other ones. So we really talked a lot about in those processes about removing our own biases and trying to understand the context of the organizations, as well as evaluating the proposal on its merits.
Yeah, when I was at Quad City Arts, we restructured a couple of the grant guidelines to have a similar approach. Mostly what we instructed our panels to do was it was really focused on less about like the grammar and less about formatting, and more about, do you understand what the project is? Can the organization complete that project? And then sort of, ranking from there and making those things. Because you're right, Katie, if somebody has a full-time staff, has a grant writer on staff, has written a bunch of successful grants, I mean, yeah, it's pretty easy to whip up a grant. But if you've never written one before, it's a challenge, or it can be a challenge.
All right. Well, thanks so much, guys. And maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more on the flip side. I'm really excited to introduce this interview with Michelle to everyone. I met Michelle during a time where I knew I needed to make a professional change. And she had been working in the region and a part of a field that I thought I was heading towards. And it was a real gift to be introduced to her and to be able to ask her questions in that time. And in a lot of ways, this interview is kind of a part 2 of that. She's worked all over the field and really has a wealth of practical knowledge and experience. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Michelle Herzog.
I am Michelle Grove Herzog, and I am an independent nonprofit consultant and the director of the Arts Administration program at the University of Arizona.
Amazing. I'm delighted that you agreed to talk with me today. I've been wanting to talk with you for a little while and share what you do in the industry with everyone. So welcome.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Delightful. So, what is your quote origin story? How is it that you got into the arts?
So I went to school for violin performance at the University of Maryland. I graduated, I was working as a professional musician in and around the DC, Baltimore, so the DMV area. Along with that, I was doing non-union contracting. People kept saying to me, wow, you're really good at this, and like you're really organized for a musician. And it just got my wheels turning, and I realized that there are options to work in the arts that weren't being the actual artist. So at that time, I did a little bit of investigating and discovered the MA program at American University in arts management. Applied, enrolled. That opened up a whole nother world to me. And my first, quote, office job, as I call it, was with the Arts and Humanities Council of Montgomery County.
That's great. So, what did you do in that first job?
Well, I was brought in to help with advocacy and helping with the grants program, along with a little bit of events work as well. That opportunity was great for me. In grad school, I knew that I wanted to do something that was bigger picture, but I didn't know what that was. And of course, being in DC and from the DC area, I was like, well, I think maybe I want to work in cultural policy. But getting that job with the Arts and Humanities Council allowed me to see that there were these other jobs that were that bigger picture. So that idea of how does the sector function and how can we assist and support the sector. So that service organization side of things. And in this case, working on a large local agency grants program that allowed me to see these other options that were a good fit for me.
Yeah. So, how did that job progress, and how did you get to being the multifaceted consultant, et cetera, that you are now?
Like I said, I started there. I was still in grad school, but upon graduating, I was brought in full time. From there, the person who was running the grants program was retiring, and I was given the opportunity then to take over as the director of that program, which was an amazing opportunity. I always talk about it: right time, right place, right aptitude. To be running a $4+ million grant making program just a few years out of grad school.
Right, because anybody who's not from the DMV area doesn't know that Montgomery County is an enormous county system. It's I'm the neighbor of Montgomery County in Fairfax, so it's not a small granting program. I mean, it really is an enormously impactful work that is happening in Montgomery County.
Absolutely.
And so then how do you get to Arizona and consulting and all of the awesome stuff that you're doing now?
From there, I was with Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation as their performing arts program officer. So from there, I went to Wesleyan University, where I was the interim associate director. That was my foray into presenting. I knew it would be good for me to work on a different side of things for a bit of time. And so I spent 2 years there in that interim role, in that interim contract. And then when that time was up, I knew that it wasn't the long-term fit for me. And that's when I moved into consulting.
Awesome.
I made that kind of active switch into consulting, which often when people go into consulting, it's almost by accident. For me, moving into consulting was intentional in that I knew that it was a style of work that fits my personality really well in terms of having projects that change and rotate over time, and that I could also then apply so many of the different skills I picked up over the years.
How do you get to leading now this arts and admin program?
The move to Arizona came again on the personal side. So coming along with my lovely partner who runs the presenting program at the University of Arizona. So the program had just launched that year and they were looking for someone to teach. And I said, sure, absolutely. Even though that first year of teaching was online, again, COVID times, even with that challenge, I still absolutely loved it, which is, I kind of always thought that I might want to go this direction. And I like to think that I kind of manifested it, in the, I'd love to do this. And then it happened. So I was asked to teach that first year. And then as that first year was coming to an end, they're like, well, we have some we'll say shifts, going on here in leadership at the university. Would you like to run the program? And so I came on in that capacity about a year and a half into the life of this program and took it from there. But started looking at the program and making some changes to make it more appealing to those undergraduate students, and then also adding graduate options to the program as well. I think, a good example is that there was no fundraising component in the program. The University of Arizona is a large state university, and so there are lots of options for courses and opportunities throughout the university. For undergraduates, I don't need to offer lots of marketing options because we have a really excellent business school, as well as some other schools that offer marketing or marketing adjacent communications courses. But there's no other place to take fundraising. We all know that fundraising is an essential skill, whether or not you realize it as an undergraduate. So even if you're in programming or education, whatever it might be, you still need to know how to fundraise.
Oh, wow. So making it more appealing to people that were there for performance majors, or just anybody who was sort of interested in adding that minor on?
So the program really is focused or tailored to all students within our College of Fine Arts, as it's named at the university.
And I asked that because in the last, 20-ish years, I might be making that up. I don't really know, but I'm going to say 20-ish years.
Go for it.
Of building arts
going
administration
yet,
programs within universities. It's definitely something that has evolved and that different programs have found their specialties. What do you think the value of these formalized arts administration education programs are?
The first question that people always ask is, do they have value? That starting at that high level, I would say yes, absolutely. What value it has to, a particular student is going to vary, but the way I talk about it with the undergraduate students in particular at this point is you're expanding your options. You're expanding your marketability, and it's for opportunities that you don't know what they are at this point. So I emphasize to the students all the time that, there's typically not a linear path in this field. You often end up not where you expected. And so by acquiring these skills and experiences, you're just going to have more opportunity as you move forward.
If you'll go with me, I'd love to change the subject and talk about something that you do a lot of work with in your consulting side of your business. And that is working with boards to make them function better, to make them work better, to serve their communities. Can you give us an idea of what those challenges are that they're facing?
To me, the biggest challenge that nonprofit boards face today is a lack of understanding about why. Why are they there? Why do they exist? My approach is that we shouldn't just accept the status quo and look at, best practice or these incremental changes, but that we really need to step back, think about why do we have boards? Well, they're legally required. So there's a start. But then from there, kind of what role should our boards actually be playing? What often happens with organizations is that people really don't understand why they're there. They don't understand the legal requirements, and they don't understand how they can actually support the organization. And so they end up being, frankly, more of a drain on the organization than a help. I'm sure there are people out there listening to this that are just shaking their head yes, because we see it over and over again. So I always walk in the door with a strong understanding of, what is best practice, what are the legal requirements of our boards, but then also taking it from there and really forcing the question of, so why are we here and how can we actually be productive and support our organizations?
And so what strategies have you found that help in these types of situations?
I think sometimes it's just about asking the question to start. So asking some of these harder questions, like, why are we here? What are we doing? And then looking at some of the activities, initiatives, whatever they might be of a board, and are these actually advancing the organization and advancing the function of the board? Or are they simply just checking a box? And I think maybe that's another area of focus for me, is trying to pull apart, when are activities or functions simply checking a box and when are they actually, helping an organization move forward.
And so do you think that disconnect happens in like an onboarding process? Is it something that just over time it's like, well, we've always done it this way? Where do you think the disconnect kind of lies?
Change is hard.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I'm a change management consultant. Might be another way to look at it. In COVID and coming out of COVID, it felt like it was this great opportunity for not just our field, but for any field. This idea of we have to remake ourselves. So this is the opportunity. It's been blown up. We probably wouldn't blow up the entire field without some sort of, hopefully, once in a lifetime sort of emergency. So this is our opportunity. Yet somehow I would argue that we've fallen right back into so many of the same patterns. And it's because back to that, human nature is change is hard. And for most of us, we want to just follow more or less a set of guidelines or a path and make incremental change rather than actually doing the hard work of stepping back and saying, okay, is this actually working? And being willing to say, no, it's not. And maybe we need to go back. We talk about, zero-based budgeting where, rather than making the incremental change or using last year's budget to build this year's budget, you start from scratch as an oversimplification, but doing that with other areas as well. So stepping back and perhaps starting over with your board. And that doesn't mean not paying attention to what we've learned in the past. It doesn't mean firing your entire board, we'll say. But it's that idea of rather than trying to tweak things, like let's start over and build from the bottom using our history as a guide.
So for somebody that, really wanted to work in sort of that big picture area of the industry, are there sort of trend, I want to say, things that you'd like to see boards change? Or, do you think it's important that, they don't have the monetary contribution or that they're looking to get younger people or more artists on board? Are there any like big picture things that you would like just generally all boards to think about in that zero-based model?
You brought up the fundraising aspect of it. That's one of the most important roles that a board plays. Let's be real. So fundraising and that legal oversight piece. I think, one of the other traps that a lot of boards find themselves in is spending so much of their time and energy self-governing.
Tell me about that.
A lot of boards get really wrapped up in their own function and end up spending so much of their energy there rather than on the actual organization that they're supposed to be there to support.
So a couple months ago when we were at APAP, you and I were just enjoying some hospitality at a party, we'll say, and probably talked about 75 different topics. But one that was super interesting to me that I haven't heard a ton of people talk about is sort of the difference between nonprofits and for-profits, and why nonprofits aren't always the right choice when you're looking to start an arts business. So can you talk about that for us?
Absolutely. That's definitely an area that I have a little bit of passion for. And again, back to that, my consulting work is very much in these kind of bigger picture, I call it field forward areas. And so the idea of kind of organizational development. And I've done work with both existing and also new organizations. And one of the things that I always talk about with organizations is, why are you a nonprofit? Or why would you become a nonprofit if you're new? And I think for so many of us in the arts, going back to the kind of what is the map, it's like, well, I'm starting an arts organization, I need to be a nonprofit. Rather than just going down that default route, actually thinking about why. Why would you be a nonprofit? So what are the reasons we become a nonprofit? I think some of the obvious answers are tax benefits, both for an organization and for its donors or potential donors. The other reason would be for fundraising, which again ties into the donors, but thinking more about grants specifically. So those are some of your bigger only reasons to really become a nonprofit. And so if you're an organization that's going to be functioning largely on an earned income model, does it really make sense for you to become your own nonprofit. I'm not saying that it's not always the right answer. I think it's more
For
about
sure.
that we need to make sure that we're not just automatically defaulting to the nonprofit, and know that, you should look at the B Corp or S Corp models. There are other options available for your organization rather than becoming a nonprofit. I think the other option that especially small organizations and individual artists need to look at is the idea of fiscal sponsorship. And I think fiscal sponsorship, for me, coming from the funding world, I know that it took me a while to not have a negative view of fiscal sponsorship. And the reason for that is that fiscal sponsorship is so often done incorrectly.
How so?
The fiscal sponsor, so the nonprofit organization, often doesn't realize that they become legally responsible for the grant or the funds that are being brought in. They are the grantee. And so there are organizations who'll be like, yeah, I'll be your fiscal sponsor. And they just sign and they think they're just passing through the money. But really, the organization or the individual you are sponsoring, they can jeopardize your nonprofit status, for example. So if they do something that is not allowable for nonprofits, so let's say they spend a bunch of money lobbying, the fiscal sponsor could lose their nonprofit status. So there's a reason that we should be hesitant about fiscal sponsorship. But at the same time, fiscal sponsorship can be done correctly. And when done correctly, it's a really great option, I think, for smaller organizations and individual artists as well to receive some of those benefits, meaning to be able to accept grants or donations that then give their donors the tax benefits if needed, while also then not having to say it casually, go through the hassle of becoming a nonprofit and, frankly, the hassle of having your own board, right, who is then in charge. And that's the other thing people don't realize is that, you might have this beautiful vision for an organization, but ultimately your board is in charge. Theoretically, you could be the founder of an organization and your board could fire you.
Yes.
That's always a shock. Not to tie the two together, I do a mock board meeting with my students every semester, and I try and get us to that point, making them realize that the board could fire this crazy founder executive director, and it's always shocking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're not raised in that, I think, in that model. Like everything is very entrepreneurial and commercial, I feel like, in the culture that we're raised in. And then you kind of start doing internships or working in this field, every board kind of functions differently and you work at different organizations and it's confusing, right? And until you really sit down and read that, you don't really understand that is very much a power that they have.
Absolutely.
And so are you finding students sort of as they're graduating, like looking into starting their own nonprofit? Is that something that students, feel like they need to do when they leave a program? Or are they doing some like gig models or, going into just a 40-hour-a-week job? Do you find you have like a lot of entrepreneurs that are looking into this?
To answer that question overall is all of the above, as we might expect. There are students that are interested in all of those areas, but there are definitely some who are at least thinking about their own organization in some shape or form.
That's awesome.
And I think there's also, compared to 20 plus years ago, not to date myself, but there is much more of an appetite for that entrepreneurial model, or even the gig economy, the idea of working for yourself and making it work. Whereas I think even graduating from music school, everyone was looking for those full-time, whether it were the military bands or full-time orchestra jobs. And I think there's a much more, in some ways, realistic view now is that, there are very few of those jobs. They might not exist. And so how can I piece it together? What are the different ways to do it?
Yeah, I'm gonna jump around again.
Go for it.
You said earlier that you went into consulting intentionally. I'm wondering what advice you give to somebody who's maybe younger or somebody who's even in their mid-career who's thinking about using their experience to help other organizations.
If you're thinking about consulting, you need to have a very strong understanding of yourself in terms of your risk tolerance, your work style. So to use myself as an example, I think work style wise, I said this earlier on too, is that I know that for me, jumping around and having different projects and having my projects change over time is not just nice for me, it's almost essential in that, I will get bored. And having new things happening keeps me engaged. I'm also very much a problem solver. Not to bring my students back into this, but it's such good examples.
Of course.
In talking with students, I'll ask them questions when they're looking for internships, especially, which is one of the aspects of the program that I oversee, is I ask them really simple questions. I'm like, what does your ideal day look like? Do you have a plan for your day and you follow that to a T? Do you have a general idea of what you need to get done? Do you want to sit in a room all day or do you need to be moving around? Do you like people? How do you feel when people come interrupt you? So there's all these sort of work style personality questions. For me, the type of consulting I do, at least, there are other areas. If you're a grant writer, that's a different style than what I'm doing. But I almost need to be solving problems, coming up with creative solutions, looking at different projects, having ideas. And to me, that's not for everyone.
For sure.
And, I have friends, I have colleagues who are like, I want to know that I'm going to work these hours, more or less. I'm going to have my list of tasks. I'm going to follow my list, and then I'm going to go home. And I'm going to have chicken, rice, and broccoli for dinner. No, I'm joking. But so I think there's that side of it, which is really important. And then also the risk tolerance side, because, back to this idea of different styles of work, being a consultant means that you are most likely, it's going to depend on, how you structure your firm, or if you're working for a larger firm as a consultant as well.
Yeah.
You can have a regular salaried job. But for me, working on my own, it means that, you might sign a contract and you might have a large influx of income on one end of, the year, and then have a lull where nothing is coming in, and you have to be okay with that. You also have to be okay with not always knowing what your next project is, and having that patience and knowing that there's a different pace of work at different times of the year, and you have to be okay with that again.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't love the uncertainty all the time, but at the same time, I love being able to control my own flow of work. Again, back to personal work style. I know that I prefer to work in more intense periods and then have more intense periods of rest, but that's not for everyone.
No.
But as a consultant, I can more or less control that.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things I do, again, to evoke the students again, graduating students, is doing some of the kind of personality and work style testing with them to help them think about these things. Things that I wish I had an opportunity to do at that point.
I was just going to say that. I didn't think about my personality when it came to sort of initially looking for a job. I love that, that real intentionality in, like you said, there's so many areas of this field that you can work in, and like what part can you sort of best serve in or best have work for yourself in.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I really wish I'd had some of that, because I didn't even get that in grad school. It was not until just being in the workplace and realizing certain things about myself, which took time, and then also being in some training programs, or I did a few different fellowships where there was that time for self-reflection, and we were given an opportunity to take some of these tests, which are not the be all end all, but they help you
for sure
in kind of discovering this about yourself.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so I know that you have listened to the podcast, and I believe you know that we have a time machine. So you get to be one of the, 100-ish lucky people to go back in time. So if you could go back and
now I know what your time machine sound is.
I mean, it is pretty top secret. We normally blur it. So
Mm-hmm. It's not like wah, 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 wah.
I can't leave you hanging like that.
Yeah.
Because I know that this is going to be great. If you could go back in time to the Michelle that was working in grad school, gigging with her studio, teaching students in that way, getting ready to graduate, but working in Montgomery, like doing like literally so many things, actually. What advice would you want to give that version of yourself? Or what do you kind of know now that you wish you knew then?
It's funny looking back because I don't know that I would actually change anything, but there are things that I would reinforce to myself and to anyone really at that point in their life, in their career. And that is just to be open to opportunity. Know that there is not a linear path. You don't know where it's going. So, like, to continue gathering experiences and just throwing them in your toolkit because you never know how it's going to turn out. A great example is, completing that master's degree in arts management, which, we could talk about, like, what has that been worth it? I'm very glad I did it, and I'm very glad I did it then. But I had no idea that I would be running an academic arts management program and that having a terminal degree would be something that I would need to be doing what I want to be doing right now. And so I think that idea of taking advantage of any opportunity that you can, because you never know how it's going to pay off in the future, because we don't actually have a time machine, Danielle. So
Rude.
Sorry, just saying, I'm a realist. We don't have a time machine that can show us the future. My point really is more so that you don't know what's coming. So gather as many skills and experiences as you can, because you never know how they're going to serve you in the future.
That's awesome. Thank you. And thank you for joining us here on There's No Business Like.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure, Danielle. Thank you for having me.
Danielle, thanks for bringing us Michelle. It was great to hear about all of her varied experiences. And I was really interested coming out of our conversation with Lenore Naxon to get her perspective on boards and board management and change management. And Kevin, I know you, from your time at Quad City, you had a ton of experience with that. So I wanted to ask you first for your perspective on what Michelle was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'll say that most of my career has been with working with boards. I mean, I was hired by the Orpheum Theater Board and I was hired by the Quad City Arts Board. This position here is the first time that I'm not managed by a board of directors. And I think that there's some pros and cons to it. I mean, obviously, like, you've got a really great opportunity to get a bunch of folks in the room who have different ideas, different perspectives. But there is that challenge of, growing a board so that it actually represents the community that you're living in. And then it's also trying to figure out how to engage a board, because in theory, the board is the one who sets the direction and the board is the one who manages the executive director. But the actual practice of that tends to be the reverse, where, the executive director tends to help manage the board and also tends to populate the board. And so it can be a challenge to make sure that you're getting the right folks on that board. So one of the approaches that I've always taken is really, kind of a basic one, just to engage my board a bit more. I started what I refer to as 7 with Kevin, because it rhymes with my name. But it's just like 7 things every couple of weeks about, like, here's what's going on in the organization. Here's things that you can talk about. Here's things that we're working on, because it just gave them an opportunity to feel like they were more involved instead of just waiting for the monthly meetings or bi-monthly meetings. But the other thing is that, working on a matrix, figuring out what things you need or what skills you need on your board. Obviously, we all want funders and fundraisers and people who can give us money. But, we also need attorneys and we need bankers and we need HR folks and we need marketers. Like, we need all of these skills if they're going to be a management board. So, I mean, honestly, like, sometimes it's a pain, but I actually enjoy it. I mean, I think it can be somewhat fun.
To Michelle's point about structure and spending too much time on structure and not enough time sort of on the governance side and setting direction and policy, what has your experience been? And if you are experiencing that, like, what would your advice be in terms of moving your board forward?
I think it all depends on the size of the staff and the size of your organization and where you're at in your life cycle. Because yes, like, you want to focus on governance, you want to have a governing board. Like, I think that's the goal to get to. But the reality is if you don't have a full-time executive director or full-time staff and it's all still volunteer run, like, that board is like, they're a working board. They're essentially the staff. And so it's, if you have a full-time staff and your board is sort of micromanaging that's the moment where you have to lean on your governance and your bylaws and point out that the board's job is to hire the executive director. And the executive director's job is to manage the organization. And so you sort of have to remind them that, like, this is why you hired me, in a very tactful way. Like, there's good ways to do that. There's also not great ways to do that. But also, I mean, just reminding them that by showing up, by doing all these things, by getting into the minutia, they're actually slowing down what's happening, what's in the organization. And frankly, you're going to burn out staff and your team's going to leave, because nobody likes to be micromanaged. And if you're going to be micromanaged, like, you're probably not needed in that organization.
I've been at the center for 18 years now. Whenever I started at the center, it was very much a board run venue, to the point that the guy who was the director at the time literally wouldn't buy a box of paper clips without asking the chairman. And so nothing was functioning. It was not a functional business model for the venue. It was not a functional thing for the board chairman, because she was basically a full-time director of the venue, because every single decision had to go through her. And then the other part of that is that we're also a city entity. And so anything that the board did really had to then be approved by the mayor, the city manager, and then the city council. And so as more government controls came into place, especially with purchasing and accounting, there was less management by the board and more management by the city. And eventually that ended up transitioning our board to more of an advisory board, not more of an advisory board, to purely an advisory board. And now, while I have board meetings and we meet as a board, all decisions really root between myself and the mayor and the city's chief of staff.
But what about the fundraising aspect of it? I mean, was that ever a part of that style of board?
So that was the original purpose of that board. When the building was first purchased and then it burned down, and then whenever a new fundraising for a new building happened, that all happened from the board. Once the building was in place, they 100% altogether stopped fundraising.
Oh, wow.
And so with no fundraising efforts in place, there was literally no role for that board at that point.
Yeah, here at FSU for opening nights, we have a development council, which is the closest thing to a board, but their role is to help fundraise. I mean, as to find sponsors, find new members. Obviously we talk about, what's coming up on the season and that sort of stuff, but like that's not their role. Like, they don't choose the season, they don't necessarily like choose staffing or those sort of things. Like, they're there to help us raise money.
Well, and all those examples too are really about finding clarity and the why of what it is that the board is there to do and to support that organization. And, really coming back to that question of why, even though kind of seems so surface, really can, I mean, it sounds like in all of these instances, like really move an organization forward and get it what it actually needs.
I think that's also one of the best things that I've done in every organization that I've been involved with. If they didn't have one, I wrote a board member job description, because it outlined not just what their job was, but it also outlined our job. So when we were onboarding a new board member, they were pretty clear that this is their role, this is our role, ours being the organization.
And I think that clarity is incredibly important. And having a real conversation with board members about, all right, here's the reality of where we're at now, and moving forward into, here is where the benefit can be and how you as a board can be of use. But the reality of what you had formerly been and the role that you had formerly played is no longer a reality. That was about a 3-hour meeting of going back and forth with board members that have been on the board for 40 plus years.
Wow.
In many cases.
Too long.
They were part of building the building. They were part of why it's here. And to not stomp on that.
Yeah, that's a tough balance, man. Like, to really to outline like how gracious and grateful you are for their support and for everything that they've done, but also trying to get them to sort of understand, like, this is the best route forward. And possibly in your case, the only route forward because of the municipal connection. I mean,
we eventually left left it up to them. I said, I would be happy to have you as an advisory board, and I run things by you at every meeting. But to be known that the decisions you make are not the decisions that are happening. And so we gave the board the option of disbanding as a board, because we're not a not-for-profit, so they're not required, or staying on as an advisory board.
Can I join your advisory board? I've got some suggestions.
Well, and Danielle, what you said about clarity and purpose and sort of the why, I think, and understanding purpose of a board actually is a really interesting thread that ran throughout your conversation with Michelle, sort of tying in with what she was talking about, the questions she asked her students, right? About their why, how they operate, how they how they see themselves moving forward in their careers. And that series of questions she asked them about, how do you like to spend your time? And, how do you handle certain situations? I think that's actually it's very similar to what we're talking about with boards and that personal discovery. And I related so much to what Michelle had to say about her work style and being excited to go from project to project. And I think it's a great moment of self-discovery when you understand that about yourself and then can apply it to the work that you're doing and maybe find a better path forward for yourself. I'm like, I need to talk to Michelle myself, because I feel like maybe we are sort of the same person sometimes. Because I also, and now doing consulting work, and that also excites me, that project-based, starting something new, solving problems, really digging in with a client. That is, it felt very familiar. And I was glad to hear somebody else has that same sort of excitement and passion around that work.
Well, and so because, we're talking through these similarities and things, did you find that you had like a similar answers kind of that she had to like the risk tolerance side of that equation? Or had you ever even asked yourself, for any of you, like that question of like, does this job fit like sort of my personality and the things that I need from work?
I'm all about risk tolerance.
He tolerates lots and lots of risk.
But the truth is, like, the position you're in is like low risk. Like, you work in a government entity, you're just a risky human.
Well, I mean, I'm also an entrepreneur and have multiple businesses and have opened and closed multiple businesses. And I mean, failed miserably in some of them. Like, the risk is there, and there's giant loss sometimes financially that comes with that. I
think in this sense, like that risk side of thing, or like what I need out of my job, I think about that often. I think about it more in the sense of like what challenges am I going to get from this? Because I think like most of us just have a problem sitting still. Like, I don't want to just do the same thing day in and day out. Like, I want to build towards something better. And if, I'm ever at an organization or get to a point in something where it's like, hey, this is going to be business as usual, I'm not interested, and I will get bored and I will leave. So I think about it in that sense.
I think for me, it's also, I want to see direct impact, and I'm a very boots on the ground, hands-on person. And if I don't see sort of the direct impact of my work on people's lives, it is hard for me to tolerate that. So I think like being in, youth and family programming in the education sphere is a good fit for me, because you see the impact on kids when they're in the theater, right? You can see it in their faces and see it in their eyes, and you can hear from the teachers how those conversations played out in the classroom afterwards and the impact that it had. And so for me, like, management where you're not sort of interacting with people and seeing impacts on a daily basis, that doesn't necessarily excite me.
So I really felt it when Michelle said that she was disappointed in the way that our industry came back from the pandemic. Our industry was 100% leveled, and we had an opportunity to come back and to reinvent ourselves as an industry, to do more equitable contracting, to just make everything more equitable. And it's almost gone the opposite direction at this point. Just over the last year and a half, a lot of organizations, and some of this is on the commercial side, but a lot of organizations in their contracts are doubling and tripling their radiuses in their contracts. And instead of it being 30 days, it's now 5 months. And so they're making it harder for artists to work through their contracting practices, and it's going in the complete opposite direction than it was before. The industry, so many people that have been in the industry for so long were so eager just to get back to the way things were before and go back to the norm that they missed every opportunity that we had to grow as an industry.
Yeah, Josh, I honestly could not agree more with you. I mean, I think that there were so many areas of our industry that were leveled that we had an opportunity to come back differently. Not to throw shade at any or certain organizations, but like conferences is one of them. I mean, we had an opportunity to come back differently and do something different, and we went back to the exact same model. Not saying that it's completely ineffective, but we haven't, at least it doesn't feel like it, like that we've taken a risk or a chance to change that. And that's just one aspect. I mean, there's so many things. And I think part of the reality is that it was easier to do it this way because we've seen this stuff done.
But I also do think that whenever you're at that place and you're making the decisions, I think you can look at what the industry does sort of like overall, or at least like the part of the industry that you interact with overall. But like anytime a lot of this big change happens, like it has to happen on an individual and a personal level. And like, I know between all of us, there are things that we have individuals have done differently. And I think there's a way to just be disappointed, and there's a way to look at it and show up as a different person and show up and take up space as the way that you want other people to also.
But I think lead by example, lead with the changes you want to see. And then there's a back end built into every single contract that we put out now. It makes it more equitable. If we're going to make money, they're going to make money. It's not going to be our organization just profiting off of artists. If we make more money, they make more money. It's for both of us now. Those are the stands that we're taking. We've also cut out all merchandise cuts because they don't get a part of our beer. We don't get a part of their merchandise. It all makes sense, but it takes leading by example to do that.
Well, and when we're looking at anything in the equity world, there's not one big answer. All of the answers are small and they're individual, and it's what makes sense for you and like your situation as well.
Yeah, Danielle, I think you do raise a good point that like a lot of these big sweeping changes will take time, and it'll take individuals making those adjustments within their own organization. And you're right. I think each of us have an example of something that we're doing that we think is going to lead us to a better position as an industry.
Well, and I think it comes back to risk tolerance, like Josh was saying, like making massive sweeps and changes is risky, right? And coming out of a time of such decimation where people couldn't pay their bills and couldn't put food on the table in our industry, I think there was a lot of hesitation to make those changes because people just needed to get back to work. So I think we need to take that into consideration too. And people need to be able to feed themselves and need to have steady employment. We lost so many folks. How do we retain the ones that hadn't drifted away during that time? So I think there's a lot of factors at play here. And so I think you, like Danielle said, you can be disappointed and we can be sad and look at that and go, okay, how do we do better moving forward? But also we have to take all of those things into consideration.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We've all, I think, have an eye towards the future and ways that we're all going to be change makers and big thinkers in this industry, like Michelle. So until next time, catch you later. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to There's No Business Like. Our producers and hosts are Brian Zelmer, Josh Benson, Kevin Maynard, Katie Miller, and me, Danielle Van Hook. Views expressed in this podcast are ours alone and are not reflective of the organizations we are a part of. Keep up with us at nobusinesslike.com. There you'll find links to all of our episodes and socials. If you like this podcast, give us a like, a follow, a review, or our favorite, a 5-star rating. Oh, wait, what was that site? I got it, don't worry. It is nobusinesslike.com. Do I sound out bus-I-ness every time I type it? Yep, sure do. Stay in touch, my friends.
Well, Leo has been asking a lot of questions about death recently.
Oh, man.
So, yeah. Like, not like morbid questions, but like serious questions about like, what happens to your soul after you die? What happens to your skin? How long does it last before it starts to decompose?
Just turn on the movie Soul from Disney.
So did you answer the question about how long his skin will last after he dies?
I said it'll last a while, but eventually it will decompose and go away. And
it actually doesn't last very long.
No, 30 days.
Yeah, it's a shockingly short amount of time.
Yeah.
Starts
So-
to decompose within hours of lack of
Yeah.
blood flow.
Maybe you like just need to take him to like the cadaver farms that they have.
Yes. I know.
Yeah.
Well, and then he was also having bad dreams about zombies, and he was waking up in the middle of the night.
So
and
maybe not the cadaver farm then. That'll
Definitely the
really-
cadaver farms.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Maybe you could watch like a documentary about human decomposition because that's fascinating.
Yeah. I don't want to do that. That does not sound good, like a good time to me.
3 months, your family can come and pick up like bags of you in like mulch.
I mean, in about
I
an
wanna do
hour,
the tree
your
thing.
family can come and pick up a bag from you. I mean,
No, but like bags and bags and bags of mulch,
Oh.
and you're just in it.
Like 3 months from right now.
I mean, like once you're dead.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's only legal in Washington, so I think you'd have to like somehow legally get your body to Washington, and then like, I don't know, it's a whole thing. Laws need to change, but it's really fucking cool.
so that we can mulch ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go mulch yourself, Josh.
I'm gonna mulch myself and send it to you all. Here's a bag of me.
They just don't recommend you put it in your vegetable garden,
Why
but you
not?
can like fertilize your flowers.
Because they don't want you to eat yourself.
Well, your
You don't-
family would eat you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have to worry
That's
about
weird.
me. Yeah.
I should have sent my finger to become mulch.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
really
you probably
should
could have just you could have mulched it yourself.
They wouldn't give it to me. I asked for it.
That is ridiculous. That is your property.
That is, that is ridiculous.
That's what I said.
I feel like it's medical waste, though, right? It's got to go into a biohazard container.
That was their stupid answer.
That's a
But it is
terrible answer.
his.
He owns it.
He
grew it
grew it.
himself.
Yeah, it should be
Technically, his
in
mother
formaldehyde.
I don't
Hi.
like that. Me and
In
Kevin
my-
think the same thing.
My mother did not grow my adult finger, for the record.
Well, she grew you as a thing with appendages.
Yeah, but our bones whenever we're born are not our bones whenever we're adults.
No, but you did have all your teeth when you were born.
Even your adult teeth.
Well, yeah, they're like in
That's
your...
why kids' faces are so much fatter.
God, I need to see
Yeah.
an X-ray of a kid's head.
I forget when I did the math of like when my kids were like because you know like whenever you're pregnant you can like follow along like on an app about like their development and like oh cool they have like legs and shit now or like you know like at one point they were like developing teeth and I was like whoa think about all the teeth that are inside of me.
There is enough to cut from this episode to fully prove that Danielle is a psychopath.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
she's talked about mulching bodies and how many teeth are inside of her. So
I mean that doesn't prove homicide anymore.
Brian, do your thing.